Today I want to share with you the best homemade Sloppy Joes recipe, and it's easy to make, cooks up quickly, and is budget friendly. Hi sweet friends, I'm Mary and welcome to Mary's Nest, where I teach traditional cooking skills for making nutrient-dense foods like bone broth, ferment, sourdough, and more. So if you enjoy learning about those things, consider subscribing to my channel. And don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. Now, the first thing I want to mention, if you open the description underneath this video, you'll see timestamps for everything that I'm going to cover, so it's easy for you to jump ahead if you want to. And also in the description underneath this video will be a link to the recipe that you can read online or print out, so you don't need to worry about writing anything down. Well, a number of years ago, I saw a recipe in a magazine for Sloppy Joes, and that really brought back a lot of memories from my childhood. My mom would make something like this homemade, but you could also buy it in the can at the grocery store. Now, unfortunately, the one in the can has a lot of ingredients that we really don't want to bring into our traditional foods kitchen. And it's also, if you've ever had it, extremely sweet, almost to the point of being cloyingly sweet. But this recipe has the perfect combination of ingredients that make it somewhat sweet and a little bit tangy, for the perfect combination that makes it so mouth-pleasing and ultimately very delicious. Plus, what makes this even better, if you saw my previous video where I showed you how to make homemade hamburger buns, we're going to be putting these Sloppy Joes onto the homemade hamburger buns. And those homemade hamburger buns are part of a series that I'm doing this year all about bread baking. So if you want to check out that recipe along with a whole bunch of others, be sure to click the iCard above or look for the link in the description below. Now, in addition to this recipe, I've got more recipes I'm going to be sharing with you in the future to show you clever ways to use those homemade hamburger buns other than just for hamburgers. And I wanted to share this recipe with you because many of you have written to me in comments and in emails and asked me to share more budget-friendly recipes. So I've got this one which focuses on ground beef, which is a little less expensive than other cuts of beef. And I've got more recipes coming down the pike, as they say, that are going to be very budget-friendly as well. Now, for this recipe, you're going to need 1 pound of ground beef. And the best combination for this particular recipe is a ground beef that's 85% lean and 15% fat. Now, most of you who have been with me for a while know that I live in Central Texas and I have the ability to shop at the wonderful grocery store H-E-B. And they have a lot of organic products and grass-fed meats and so on and so forth. And they have them for very reasonable prices because they're really on a mission to provide these types of foods for their customers. And so what I have here is a 1 pound package, and this actually comes in a 2 package and sometimes a 3 package set, so you can get a pretty good buy on it. You're sort of buying in bulk. But this is 100% grass-fed, and what's really nice about this, it's also grass-finished. And why that is important is when you're looking for ground beef, if you can find ground beef that says grass-fed and grass-finished, that's going to have the highest amount of something called CLA. Now, I'm going to say what that stands for, but please forgive me if I make any mispronunciations, because you know I'm the queen of mispronunciations, but you can always spell it out for me phonetically in the comments below. But I believe CLA stands for conjugated linolenic acid. And that is a wonderful nutrient for our bodies. So if you find ground beef that is also grass finished, it has the highest amounts of this CLA. What happens is you may have cattle that is grass-fed, it's raised on pasture, as a lot of cattle is, but then at the end of their lifespan, many commercial beef producers will feed their cattle different things, maybe corn or something similar to that, some type of grain, to fatten them up and make the beef more marbled and therefore, more tasty. The only problem is that fat is not as high in the CLA as if the cattle had been allowed to be grass-fed right through the end of their life. So whenever you can find grass-finished, that's a plus. Now I want to take a minute before we start making this recipe and talk to those of you who may be farther along on your traditional foods journey, or maybe beginners who are just very enthusiastic. Recipes that you make using ground beef are wonderful ways to start incorporating organ meats into your traditional foods kitchen. Sometimes if you're new to eating traditional foods, or you're trying to introduce them to your family that may not immediately be open to, hey kids, we're having heart for dinner, liver, kidneys, and so on and so forth. Hiding things mixed with ground beef and a lot of spices can be a wonderful way to start introducing that nutrition in a little bit of a hidden way into your own diet as well, if you're a little uncomfortable about eating those things, as well as the diet of your family and your friends if they're interested in having more traditional foods as well. Now I do have a recipe for beef liver that is definitely kid tested and, as my husband says, husband approved as well. And I'll be sure to link to that in the iCards and in the description below if you want to give that a try. However, if you are new to incorporating organ meats into your diet. And why do we want to incorporate organ meats? We want to incorporate organ meats because they are very nutritious. And it's really good to get into that habit of eating nose to tail, wasting nothing and eating everything. That the animal, has made the ultimate sacrifice for us so that we can be fed very nutritiously. And organ meats are very high in vitamin A and vitamin D, nutrients that often are deficient in our diets. And when you find that you have sufficient vitamin A and especially sufficient vitamin D in your diet, you can have strong bones and be very resistant to illness. So I just wanted to take a second to show you that this is a ground beef. I just got this out of my freezer, but this is a ground beef and it contains heart, liver, and kidney. Now it's primarily ground beef and you really don't taste the heart, liver, and kidney. And if you use it in a recipe like this, it's very well disguised. It's also great for if you're making a bolognese spaghetti sauce. It's also great for making meatballs, different things like that, chili. It's perfect. And this way you're getting that wonderful nutrition that you get from organ meats without really the taste if you've not developed a taste yet for heart, liver, and kidneys. But I've showed you how to make liver in a very delicious way, and I'll eventually show you how to make heart and kidneys in a delicious way too. But in the meantime, something like this is a wonderful option. Now, can you just make your own mix? Definitely. If you can chop it up by hand, or if you have a food processor, it can work wonderful. Or if you have a meat grinder, either a manual one or maybe one that's connected to like a stand mixer, you can grind up a little heart, you can grind up a little kidney, you can grind up a little liver, and then you can mix that in with your chopped meat. And so you're making your own blend. This one is from US Wellness Meats, and I've talked to you about this company before. Sometimes if I can't find, sometimes I can find liver, but I can't always find heart and kidneys. And this is nice because it does already come pre-mixed. And so I do buy things sometimes from US Wellness Meats. And if it's something that you're interested in looking at, be sure to check the description underneath this video because I have a discount coupon code that's a really good savings. I think it's about a 15% discount coupon code. So if you ever order meats online because you can't find what you want locally, definitely check out that. It's a nice savings. However, I often recommend first look at your supermarket. Supermarkets have a lot of wonderful things today. Also check your farmer's market. And if you live in an area like I do, where there are ranches all around, definitely talk to ranchers about what they may have for sale. There was a time when I would buy so many of my bones locally and the ranchers were so happy to sell them to me because nobody wanted them, but then bone broth became very popular, so now they're in demand. But that is definitely something to look into, and often if you talk to a rancher and you want to buy a lot of things, if you have an extra freezer, you can buy a half a cow or a quarter of a cow. You can go in with other people and each of you buy a half a cow. And often, if you do buy something with other people, they often want different cuts of meat than you may want, and so you may wind up getting most of the bones and the oxtails and the organ meats, and it can be a wonderful savings. So definitely investigate that. But if that's not something available to you, I really like U.S. Wellness Meats. I know. Be sure to check the comments below, because a number of you have shared with me other places that you really like ordering different kinds of meats from, and so be sure to check those out too. Now you know why I put in timestamps, because I like to be very thorough and give you a good explanation, especially about the foods that we're going to be using and how they fit into a traditional foods kitchen and a traditional foods diet before we actually get cooking. But you do always have those timestamps so that you can jump ahead if I'm sharing things with you that you already know. However, I do want to say to the beginner, never feel pressured that you have to buy a particular thing. If all you can find at your grocery store is just regular ground beef, that's fine. Don't worry. Stay in your budget, and then over time, as you're on this traditional foods journey, you can start moving monies away from processed foods, which often are more expensive, to more whole foods, grass-fed foods, and whole foods in the sense of meaning real foods, not necessarily the store. But you can move your grocery budget money around so that you stay in your budget, but that you start buying better food. And that's something I always will tell you, stay in your budget. I think that's very important. You don't want to stress yourself. And take this journey slowly, little by little, step by step. This can take a year or two to have a full-blown up and running traditional foods kitchen. And so take these steps little by little, and you're going to be a success. Alrighty, now let's get cooking. Now I've got my ground beef here in a bowl, and what I'm going to do is go ahead and add in just a little less than a half a teaspoon of baking soda. And then to that, and I'll explain in a minute why we're adding some baking soda in here, then I'm going to go ahead and add about a half a teaspoon of salt. And that's just a plain ground, fine ground sea salt. And the reason that we're adding the baking soda is that the baking soda will help the ground beef stay very tender and moist, which is something that can be somewhat of a problem when you have a recipe like this and you're just kind of cooking it up and browning it. When you go to eat it, like especially in a sloppy joe like this, or a chili, or a spaghetti sauce, the meat can have a little bit of a bite or a little bit of a tough texture to it. But the baking soda will actually help keep it very tender and moist. I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised. Now you can get in here with clean hands and just start mushing this up. I know some of you have shared with me you're a little queasy about that. You can certainly wear gloves, or a potato masher works wonderful. But I'm just going to go ahead and get in with clean hands, and we'll get this all mixed up nicely. Well, I've got my ground beef mixed in with the salt and the baking soda, and I'm going to set that aside. I've washed my hands so we can start fresh and clean. And what we're going to do is put 2 teaspoons of olive oil into a flat bottom pan. A flat bottom pan works best for this so that you can really cook up your onions and your beef. And I'm just going to put 2 teaspoons of olive oil, which I find the olive oil works really well for this. You could certainly use some butter or some ghee, or a combination of butter and ghee. However, I just think that the olive oil works really well. Then what I've got here is 1 small onion. Now I've grated this, and I've just used one of these box graters, and I've used the large grate. I find that it mixes very nicely with the meat, but if you prefer to see chopped onion in your sloppy joe, you can certainly do that. Well, let me turn this on to medium heat, and we'll get cooking these onions. So I'm just going to get these onions in here, and then I'm actually going to use a little more baking soda but just a pinch. You don't want to overdo, because the baking soda will actually help soften these onions, because you do want them to be nice and soft once you mix them in with your chopped meat. And really, this is just going to take 1 to 2 minutes or so to soften up, because I've grated it. If you've chopped them, maybe 2 to 3 minutes, but you're just looking till they're nice and translucent, and then we'll be ready to move on to the next step. Now, while I'm sauteing these, I just want to mention that a lot of you have asked me about this burner, and so I was able to find it online. This I've had for a while, so I wasn't sure that I could actually find this online, but I did, and I'll be sure to put a link to it below. It's a Cuisinart countertop burner, and it's terrific. I'm really happy with it. It does run a little hot, so you do need to be careful with it. Chances are it'd be very rare that, I think they have a setting 5 for high. I think it'd be very rare that you would go up to that high a temperature. I find that anything over 3 kind of starts to get a little too hot, but it works great, and I've been very happy with it. Next to the sauteed onion, I'm going to go ahead and add in 2 cloves of garlic. And I have just gone ahead and mashed these in a mortar and pestle, but you can definitely just chop them up as well. And just mix that in with the onion and saute about another minute or so. It'll start to become really fragrant. Now, it doesn't take long at all for that garlic to start becoming very fragrant, about 30 seconds. It smells wonderful. Now, of course, if you don't like garlic, if you can't digest garlic, you can definitely leave it out, but it does add something wonderful to these sloppy joes. Okay, next we're going to add in a ½ teaspoon of salt. We're going to add in a tablespoon of sucanat, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And we're going to add in a teaspoon of paprika, and this is the sweet paprika. If you like a smoky flavor, you could definitely use the smoked paprika, but I've just got the sweet paprika here. And then I have a ½ teaspoon of red pepper flakes. Now, if you don't like things spicy, you can leave that out. If you want it to be a little less spicy, you could just use like a 1/4 or an 1/8 of a teaspoon of red pepper flakes. That's totally up to you. However, I do want to just take a second to talk about the sucanat. Now, you could certainly use brown sugar in this recipe if you've not started incorporating more whole sweeteners into your traditional foods kitchen. Sucanat simply stands for sugarcane natural, and all it is the dried sugarcane juice, so all the minerals and whatnot are intact. Now, if all you have is white sugar, yes, you can substitute that. However, the brown sugar, because it has the molasses in it, does add a richness of flavor to this particular recipe. So that's something to consider. If you have white sugar and some molasses, you can easily make a homemade brown sugar. And I show you how to do that in another video, which I'll definitely link to in the iCards or in the description below. And I'll also put everything in the pinned comment, because I know some of you have told me that it's easier for you to find things in the pinned comment rather than in iCards or in the description. So go ahead and use brown sugar if that's all you have at this point in your kitchen. It'll work great. And if not, in a pinch, you can use white sugar, if you don't have any molasses on hand. But okay, we'll go ahead and we'll add all that in right on top of our onion garlic mixture. And we'll stir that all around. And you just want to cook all of this together for about a minute. It's going to become very fragrant. And once you start smelling all of the paprika, and the red pepper flakes, if you're using them, you get a little bit of that spicy fragrance coming up. You know that you're ready to move on to the next step, but it just takes about a minute. Next to this mixture, we're going to add a 1/4 cup of tomato paste. And this is really what makes this so special, because you'll see when we get to the point of adding in the ketchup that sloppy joes often are associated with adding in a lot of ketchup. But that can really make this dish overly sweet. And this way, by using a little bit of tomato paste and some of the other ingredients, which I'll share in a bit, it helps give you wonderful tomato flavor without overpowering you with a lot of sweetness. So what you want to do is just mix in your tomato paste with all of the other ingredients in here until it's well mixed with the spices and the onions and the garlic, and just cook it for a minute or two. Now we're going to go ahead and add in our beef mixture. Now, if you have one of those special little tools for breaking up ground beef in a frying pan or a Dutch oven, whatever the case may be, whatever your recipe you're making, that works great for this job. But I'm just going to use my spatula at this point, and then I'm going to switch over to my potato masher, which works really well. When the ground beef has started to brown up and you don't see any more pink, this is the perfect time to move over to using your potato masher. Now, if you've got one of those tools that breaks up chopped meat, and I just want to mention, I go back and forth between the term ground beef and chopped meat. I think chopped meat might be the more old-fashioned expression, something that I always heard my mother refer to ground beef as. But no matter what, if you've got one of those tools that breaks up ground beef, you can use that here. But a potato masher works really well, because what we're going to do is we're going to go around and we're going to press on all of this chopped meat until we get a really fine texture. Now, yes, you can do this, you continue to do this with your spatula or a wooden spoon. Sometimes if you have one of those spoonula type wooden spoons that have the straight bottom, that can work very well, but this makes quick work of it. And it took about 5 minutes to cook this ground beef so that there was no more pink remaining. And now I'm just going to take my potato masher and start pushing this all around. And we're going to get this into a very fine texture. That's what makes it's just so pleasing in a sloppy joe when the meat has a really fine texture. Now, once you get this to a nice fine texture, we're going to go ahead and add in our ketchup. Now, if you've been with me a while and you've made the homemade fermented ketchup with me, you can certainly use it here. However, keep in mind that that's a fermented food, and so it's very rich in the good bacteria, the probiotics that we like to have in our traditional foods kitchen, in our traditional foods diet, to increase good gut health. Because as I've said many times, as scientists tell us, good gut health means that we're probably very healthy overall. So just keep that in mind, that you will kind of be reducing the beneficial bacteria. So using some store-bought ketchup for this recipe is completely fine. Now, we're only putting in 1/3 cup of ketchup. But don't worry, because I know if you look at a lot of Sloppy Joe recipes, they'll call for sometimes as much as of a cup of ketchup. But remember, we did put in that tomato paste, so that kind of makes up for it. Then, to add a little tang, we're going to add a tablespoon of red wine vinegar. And red wine vinegar works very well in here, but if you make your homemade apple cider vinegar, that if you've been with me a while, you've probably made that too, and if that's something you want to learn how to make along with the fermented ketchup, I'll be sure to link to those videos. But you can certainly use your homemade apple cider vinegar here, but like the fermented ketchup, that's a fermented food, and so it is very high in beneficial bacteria, good bacteria, the good probiotics, and so you'll be cooking that out. However, you can certainly use it if that's what you have on hand. I bought this red wine vinegar actually to use in this recipe and a few others that I'm going to be using, and again, you know, H-E-B, it's great store, and it's a great buy. So I was fine to add that to my pantry. Now what we're going to do is add a tablespoon of Worcestershire sauce. And there's something about Worcestershire sauce. This is just a magical ingredient. And it always adds such, I guess chefs say, umami flavor. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. but it really adds a wonderful flavor to these sloppy joes. And so once you get your ketchup and your vinegar and your Worcestershire sauce in here, we'll get ready to give this a stir. This smells so good. And as you see, it comes together relatively quickly. And you can literally have this ready in what, maybe 20 minutes, if that long. So, something I want to say about sloppy joes. Sloppy joes, as the name implies, is sloppy. But that's kind of the fun of it. However, I like to add a little bit of cornstarch to just help give it a little more body, a little more thickness, so that it really stays on the bun, or between the top and the bottom of the bun when you slice it up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take about a tablespoon of water and a half a teaspoon. You don't need much, just about a half a teaspoon of cornstarch. Now, if you can't take cornstarch, don't worry. There are other thickeners that you can use, like arrowroot. You can also just use a little all-purpose flour if that's what you have. I'm just going to mix this up, and then I'm going to go ahead and add this into my sloppy joe mixture. Now I've got that cornstarch and water mixture in here with my ground beef, and I've mixed this up all very well until that's completely incorporated. And then I'm going to cook this for about a minute or two, just to let that all thicken up nicely. Then we'll get ready to give it a little taste to see if it needs any additional seasoning. And then we'll put some on one of those homemade hamburger buns. I'll show you those, and we'll give it the official taste. Now I want to mention that this makes enough for 4 sloppy joes. And if you're feeding small children, you might even be able to stretch it to 6. But this recipe can easily be doubled or even tripled if you're feeding a crowd. Well, this looks great and it smells wonderful. I've just got a little bit here on a tasting spoon just to check it for seasoning. So we'll see how it is. Oh, that's perfect. I don't think it needs anything else. But if you want, after you taste it, when you make this, you can always add a little more salt, a little more of the sucanat or some brown sugar, or a little bit more of the vinegar. Well, here are these glorious homemade hamburger buns that I made. So we'll slice one up and we'll get ready to put our sloppy joe mixture on it. So let's take this one. I'll also show you this up close. I think you're going to be so pleased. Homemade hamburger buns are really relatively easy to make, and I think once you start making them homemade, you're really never going to want to buy them at the store again. I mean, just look at this interior. They're light and they're fluffy inside, but they've got a pretty good texture on the outside, which makes them so nice for holding things like a really juicy hamburger or something like sloppy joes without becoming a big mushy mess that just falls apart like a lot of the hamburger buns you can buy at the grocery store. These just hold up so beautifully to really anything you want to put them on, and you can make a whole bunch and use them not only for hamburgers and sloppy joes. You can use them for making sandwiches, anything you want. And I've also got a very clever recipe coming up over the next few weeks showing you how I use hamburger buns that I think you're going to really enjoy. So if you're subscribed to my channel and you receive notifications, you'll see when that video comes out. And if you're not subscribed, maybe you'll consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell so you'll find out about that recipe. I think you're all going to be very pleased with it. Well, I've got some on this bun now, and we're just going to have to give this a taste and see how it is all together. That is a really good sloppy joe. I think you're going to so enjoy this. I really hope you'll make this. Now, if you'd like more easy to make, budget-friendly recipes that are also ready in no time at all, be sure to click on this video over here, and I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country Kitchen. Love and God bless.